From today's psalm, the Lord loves the righteous. The Lord cares for the stranger. He sustains the orphan and the widow, but frustrates the way of the wicked. Please be seated. This is, of course, stewardship time of year, and today's readings from Kings 17 about the widow who gives the last of her food to Elijah, and from Mark chapter 12 about the widow who gives her last 2 pennies to the temple treasury are, not surprisingly, ones that are often used to convey the message of how we should give generously. Today's passages do indeed offer valuable lessons on giving, and the simple truth is that we rely on people to give their time and money to support our church and its mission. I've had the great opportunity over the years to be involved with several stewardship campaigns, and as warden, stewardship and the financial well-being of our beautiful campus and its staff are important and worthwhile components that come with the position. I'm always in awe of the overwhelming generosity of our parish family, from the food you give to your time, raking leaves, laying carpets, arranging flowers, your talents, and from your financial advice, your legal advice, your video streaming, your treasures, all of your pledges. I love that we often include our younger generations, our children, in thinking about and participating in exemplary acts of giving. Those early lessons on sacrificial giving are so very important. Teaching our youth that the gifts that are most pleasing to God are the ones that are given out of gratitude and a spirit of generosity will indeed prove valuable lifelong lessons. I know this because I was fortunate to have these kinds of lessons given to me as a young child, although it may not have seemed it at the time. Growing up, we had a large garden, a huge garden, that my dad was very proud of. There were enough vegetables that we had a small farm stand, and it was not unusual for people to knock on the door or come through to the backyard to purchase whatever was in season. The vegetables were sold or practically given away were the best of the best. The perfectly ripe tomatoes, the right-sized squashes and peppers. The garden fed our family, my aunts and uncles' families, people my parents worked with, neighbors. It was a lot of work. And every neighborhood kid knew that if you wanted to play in our yard, because we had a pool, and my dad was around, you were probably going to have to work in the garden. And when I got older and realized what my dad was charging people for these literal fruits of my labor, the entrepreneurial part of me said to him, "Dad, we should charge more. You know, people have to pay a lot more in the store for a pound of tomatoes." And I remember exactly where we were, sorting those perfect tomatoes from the ones that were not so perfect, the ones we would eat for dinner. And my father looked at me and smiled and said, "We just need to charge enough to cover the cost of the seeds, Annie." There was no elaboration at the time as to what he meant. There was no arguing, and my dreams of getting an increase in my allowance were swiftly, squashed. But I understood. I just didn't know at the time exactly the breadth of the seeds that garden was spreading. It's not unusual, even now, after so many years of my father being gone, for people to remember the garden and my father's generosity. But for me, the seeds planted back then went way beyond the actual vegetables produced. The seeds planted brought neighbors and families together, reminded and still reminds people to be generous in kind. Those seeds were a way of paying it forward, good lessons to be learned and remembered. The widows in today's passages go way beyond providing vegetables at lower than market value prices. We understand that the widow at the temple gives everything away, everything she has. By comparison to the rich people tossing in large amounts, her 2 pennies were of little value. But are we to judge and say that her giving is better than those who gave out of their excess? Well, of course it is. At least in this story it is. But what if the message is not about comparing one act of giving to another, but rather in how the gift is given? That it is about one's commitment when giving the gift. In sermon group, when we were going over the readings for today, Jennifer mentioned that she likes to think of people giving out of an abundance of love. I like that image. It allows me to be less judgmental and more grateful for all kinds of giving, no matter how much or how little the gift or what percentage of someone's wealth. And it reminds me that my own giving should be thoughtful, should have meaning, should never be for show, and should always be given with love. There's this organization I've participated in called Lasagna Love. Maybe some of you have heard about it. It was started by a couple of women in Massachusetts who started making lasagnas for people in need. People nominate people to receive one, sometimes because the person or family is struggling financially, or maybe has had a death in the family, or recovering from surgery. Lasagnas are delivered to homes, to motels, and sometimes even cars. Lasagna Love has grown into a national cause and has a rather elaborate online application to organize people making and receiving the lasagnas. It also has a Facebook page where the people making them sometimes post pictures of their end products. I'm always drawn to these Facebook postings. I love to see how proud first-time lasagna makers are, or how creative folks are with designs they put on top of them, like making hearts out of peppers and mozzarella cheese. But I'm mostly intrigued by the backgrounds that folks are cooking in. Some of beautiful kitchens with pictures of jarred sauce in the background. Some are just regular kitchens, but with pots of bubbling over homemade sauce. And then every once in a while, there's a picture of someone making lasagna in a kitchen that looks like they could use a lasagna themselves. And what I love about these images is that it reminds me that it doesn't matter how rich or how less rich the pictures portray people, all of the lasagnas that are being given out are given out of an abundance of love. While working on my sermon this week, I came across another view of Mark's passage that is often less mentioned or even thought about. We so often focus on the scribes, the widow, the pennies. But there is this other storyline that almost goes unnoticed. In David Lose's sermon, he points out that despite the fact that this widow only gives 2 pennies and that she likely does not have any colorful robes to make her stand out, Jesus notices her. He sees her. She is somebody to him, not simply because she gave her last pennies, but because of the spirit in which she gave those pennies. She had great faith and trust, and she gave out of sacrifice and surrender. This kind of giving is what gets God's attention. It is why Jesus noticed her. We don't know what happens to the widow. The passage doesn't tell us that. It does not say that she's taken care of or that she is rewarded in some way. Our faith and our trust in God tells us that she probably is, but in this story, we don't know that. And maybe that's because what Jesus really wants us to focus on is not that if you sacrifice, you will be rewarded, but rather that we need to notice. We need to pay attention and see and think about why we give, who we give to. We need to notice the widows, the homeless, the lonely, the uncared for, the vulnerable, the sick, the elderly, and the hungry. You know, when it comes to money and what it takes to continue to run this place, we just have to cover the cost of the seeds. Because if we invest in those seeds, if we lay that foundation and continue to plant those seeds as we have for 125 years, then the real value, the real rewards will be that we will continue to have a place that teaches us to value all gifts, to give out an abundance of love, and to notice the unnoticeable, as Jesus calls us to do. Amen.